everyone up here to work. I will call the meeting of the Board of Directors of the Santa Margarita Groundwater Agency. Can I get a roll call, please?
Yes, sir. Director Engfer.
Here.
Director Leopold.
Here.
Director McPherson.
Here.
Director Cassidy.
Here.
Director Franklin.
Here.
Director Pollock.
Here.
Director Dillis.
Here.
Director Ferris.
Here.
Director Henry.
Here.
Director Stiles. Director Perry.
Here.
Director Baskin. Director Brown. Director Koopman.
Here.
As a non-voting observer, correct?
Correct.
Director Hayes. Director Lind. Director Moran.
Present.
Same capacity, sir. Director Reber. You have a quorum of 10.
Quorum. Excellent. Okay, are there any additions or deletions to the agenda? Okay,
There's
hearing
none
none.
for staff.
Okay. Hearing none. Are there any oral communication from anybody on matters not on the agenda tonight? Okay. Hearing none. Can I get the approval of the minutes for the December 11th board meeting?
I'll move the minutes.
All those in favor?
Aye.
I will abstain, Chair, because I wasn't here.
Okay. All those opposed? Okay, they carry.
Director Perry. That was unanimous with Director Leopold abstaining, correct?
Yes.
Got it.
And I'm going to steal someone's agenda because my thing just went crazy. Approval of the minutes. I meant January 23rd. That is my mistake. Committee meeting reports are none, and informational session, consent agenda is none. And then the informational session on groundwater sustainability plan, GSP elements, 411, the roadmap that we talked about. Is there any?
There's nothing to add from staff unless there's any questions.
Is there any questions from anybody in the public on that roadmap? Okay. 4.1.2 Sustainable Management Criteria for Groundwater Quality. Georgina King is here, and Rosemary Menard from the city is also going to speak to us. I'm going to turn it over to Georgina to give us a full education.
Okay.
We'll be experts after this.
Well, I apologize in advance. I'm going to be talking a lot tonight. And I did get Rosemary to help me out because hearing from me all night would be just unbearable for everyone, including myself. So, and John is also going to step in a little bit, and I might call on some other people randomly here. So, I've got like three presentations myself. So, I'm just preparing you for what's to come here. The first one I'm going to talk about is on the sustainable management criteria, and these, you've heard of these before, and you will continue to hear about these a lot over the next year, for sure. And what I'm going to do on them, because you have heard them before, is to recap them. Is to recap some of that terminology, because it is kind of non-intuitive, because when they wrote the Act, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, they put all these terms in there that we haven't used before, and that they need to go over them with you a few times before they'll really sink in. And then I'm going to talk about the general process that we plan to use to determine each of the criteria that make up this suite of sustainability management criteria. So, jumping right in here, what are they? There are this handful of terms that will define sustainability in the basin, and that's really hard to conceptualize. So, and the only way we're really going to understand it is to go through developing them. But I'm going to give you a brief overview here of the terminology. The first one being the sustainability goal, and you all should be familiar with this because we drafted, we came up with a draft statement of what the sustainability goal would be. And we may change that based on the other work that we do over this year, but we already have that. It's a descriptive statement of what we want sustainability to look like in this basin. And that's something you do for the entire basin. It's one statement, it covers everything. But then for each of the 6 sustainability indicators, of which only 4 are applicable in this basin, we've already decided seawater intrusion and land subsidence don't apply. So for each of the 4 remaining ones, we have to develop this suite of sustainability management criteria. And you've heard them before, things like undesirable results. Now this is the most difficult of the criteria to understand. Thus far I haven't really gone into it too much with you, but today we will. And I will pause, I hope I remember to pause to make sure that everyone is on board with what, with how I'm describing it. It's both descriptive and numeric. And then there's minimum thresholds, you've heard this, measurable objectives, these are more easy to understand, and interim milestones. These are all numeric numbers that you can say this is the groundwater levels should not go below this level, or this is where we would like it to be, is the measurable objective. I'll show you those on a chart, so hopefully it makes more sense to you. So jumping in right away with the most difficult one, undesirable results. The undesirable result is how you prove that this basin is sustainable, avoiding these undesirable results. And that's what DWR is going to look at 20 years down the line to say, did your plan achieve sustainability? They're going to look at undesirable results. They're not going to look at measurable objectives or at minimum thresholds. It's this mashup thing called undesirable results. And it's in the regulations, it's described, and this is a lot of words that when I first read them, I didn't make sense to me at all. So the description of undesirable results shall be based on a quantitative description of the combination of minimum threshold exceedances that cause significant and unreasonable effects in the basin. Oh, that really doesn't make too much sense. So I have an example on the next slide that will hopefully make it a little clearer to you. The most important thing to remember here is that undesirable results are a combination of minimum thresholds. So, for example, this is a fictitious basin. Obviously, this little yellow blob, and there's 10 wells that we're using to monitor sustainability in the basin. We've set thresholds for all of these. We don't want water levels to go below a certain level. There is one though the one in the red. That one is below the level that we had set as a minimum threshold. So, but the GSA for this basin had said an undesirable result in groundwater levels would occur when 20% of the groundwater levels measured at representative monitoring points drop below their respective thresholds. So this is only 1 out of 10, so that's 10%. This basin is sustainable. If it was 2 of those wells, it would not be sustainable. So this is where the complexity comes in. It's not just the minimum threshold, which is a number you give per well. Each well would have its own minimum threshold, but it's this combination of you can say the average water level. You can put in a statistic, so it's not the absolute elevation. And this is how you can accommodate flexibility. In some cases, you may want to have it, you can never go below the level, but in other cases, you might want to say we want some more flexibility to avoid undesirable results, because we can't control everything all of the time. And so you might want to build in some of these combinations into it. So what does this, so partly what this looks like on the chart, I think you've seen this chart before. The blue squiggly line is groundwater level over time, historically, say the last 20 years. And now we get to 2022 when the GSP has to be done, and now we're in we have to implement the GSP. We need to get to sustainability. We've established that there's this minimum threshold. This is where we don't want groundwater levels to go below. And any groundwater level below that would be significant and reasonable. So in this area, if groundwater levels went below this line, the local private well owners couldn't pump the same amount of water they used to pump. Next, we establish the measurable objectives. It's where we would like to be, where we would want groundwater levels to be at the end of the 20-year implementation period, where we have to prove to DWR the basin is sustainable. And we have to, so we've got 20 years to achieve sustainability. We can have water levels go below that minimum threshold for the next 20 years, but by that 20 years, you need to be up near the measurable objective, and you need to maintain that for a further 30 years. So it's a 50-year planning horizon here. The difference between these two gives you operational flexibility. For example, in 2045, you're up at the measurable objective, and there's a 10-year drought. We will have established a minimum threshold that's low enough that we'll be able to take that. Because if now groundwater levels went below that red minimum threshold line, then you would be unsustainable. So this is called operational flexibility. You don't want to keep your well, the groundwater level in this well at the minimum threshold, because unforeseen things happen, and you want to have this buffer. So it's kind of like a buffer. And then there are these orange diamonds, and there's 3 of them there. They're at 5-year intervals, and the Act requires you to include interim milestones every 5 years. It coincides with when there's a 5-year review on the report, or on the GSP, every 5 years there'll be a review where you can change things, or if you've gained new understanding, you can include that in your GSP. So these are illustrated on this chart. I'm not sure how accurate they're going to be, because this is the predictive period, and we're just really guessing at what those would be. There's climate, we've guessed on climate, we've guessed on demand, and we've done our best effort, and that's why every 5 years we'll revisit those. So how we plan to develop the sustainability management criteria, there's a few steps. The first is assess which of the indicators are applicable. We've done that already, right? So check that off. And the next thing is to understand the historical groundwater conditions pertaining to each of those indicators. So I've talked to you about groundwater elevations or levels in the basin, and shown you how groundwater levels have gone down historically, how they've stabilized now, even increasing. And today I'm going to talk to you more about groundwater quality. Before I did a one-slide thing. This is going to be a bit more than that, and hopefully give you more background understanding to make the decisions that you need to make about the sustainability of that indicator. So the first thing that we'll do is find out from you all what you think significant and reasonable conditions are with respect to degraded groundwater quality, of which we'll be coming later. But for each of the indicators, this is what we're going to do. We're going to talk about significant and reasonable. Then we will talk about undesirable results. What do they look like for that indicator? Because all of these things build on each other. We can't do any of the technical work until we know what significant and reasonable is in this space, and what does it look like. and then we build minimum thresholds into it, and then measurable objectives. So it's not a stepwise thing, but I'll show you there's also some iteration within that. And the next slide is about that iteration. So what we would do is, for each of the indicators that are listed there, it'll be, a meeting like this, and I won't just say to you, okay, so what do you think is significant and reasonable? I'll give you some examples, and I'll give you some options to think about, maybe bookend, something like that. Tell you what, now we have the luxury of using what have other basins said about, what have they developed for their SMCs, and also to remind you it's an iterative process here. So I don't have a pointer really, but in that spiral diagram that you've seen before, the first part, the orange part, is talking about understanding the basin. We really have to understand it first, and then we're into the initial design. So we're starting to develop some of these criteria, but also I need to stress, what we talk about today may change down the line. What you say is not cast in stone. And as we learn more about the basin, as we figure out what the other indicators are going to look like, we can't have competing thresholds set. They all have to work together. You can't, by setting one threshold, make it impossible to achieve thresholds in another indicator. So there's all these ways that you may have to change things further down the line. So there's definitely opportunities for changing things. And also, DWR has realized that no one's going to get this right on the first GSP. We are allowed to change the GSP as we go, as we implement it, when we realize, oh, maybe that was a bad decision, or we didn't have enough data, now we have more data, let's add that into the mix. So it's called adaptive management, and that's what DWR is encouraged in this GSP process. So a bit more on significant unreasonable. It's a funny negative thing. It's what we want to avoid. What do we not want to happen in the basin? And in the Act it says that the GSAs must consider and document the conditions at which each indicator becomes significant and unreasonable. And we're going to have that discussion today about degraded groundwater quality. And we have to provide the reasons for justifying what's significant and unreasonable, and for the threshold. So there's a lot of backup information. It's not just the board decided this. I have to give a lot of backup for that as well. And so this, as I mentioned before, this is a descriptive statement that is the basis for the undesirable results. So once we know what we have an idea what would be a significant and unreasonable conditions in the basin, then we need to consider beneficial uses of that water, of the groundwater, and land use and property interests. And then we will kind of massage this into what does an undesirable result look like, because the undesirable results have to improve. They're undesirable to who and what and how. So these are all questions that we will consider and use when we develop these statements. Whoa. I'm obviously talking way too slowly. These are, I think this is where these are example significant and reasonable statements that you could possibly have. Just to give you a flavor, these don't actually come from any particular GSP, and for the degraded groundwater quality one that we'll be talking about earlier, I'm going to give you actual examples from other GSPs, but this would be kind of the flavor that you would have for significant and reasonable. For groundwater levels, you'd say, well, a significant unreasonable condition would be when groundwater levels lower such that private pumpers cannot meet their demand anymore. Okay, it's not very, it's somewhat descriptive, but it's not very detailed. It doesn't have numbers. It's just a qualitative statement. Another one, groundwater quality as a result of GSP implementation degrades to worse than drinking water standards for any constituent of concern. There's a bit more information in there. Another one could be, you could say groundwater levels lower such that groundwater dependent ecosystems can no longer be supported. So that one would pertain probably to the depleted surface water indicator. So these are things that would be considered significant and reasonable to the users in this basin. And everyone's going to have a different opinion, and we'll talk about it today. If it takes a long time, I think we may, we will be listening to everything, and we'll draft up a statement and come back to you. But we'll get to that when we get to the water quality one. So now if we've established what we think is significant and reasonable, now we get on to undesirable results. And so this would be where we describe what these results might look like based on data that is measured at representative monitoring wells. Now, representative monitoring well, representative monitoring point, is a place where we would set the SMCs. You don't set it for every single well. That would just be too much work for everyone, and GWR realizes that it's often better to select a well that's representative in an area and work from it that way instead of we can't control every single square inch of the basin. So you select wells that are representative of the aquifers and of the uses in that area. Let me see. Nick, can you advance just one? Okay. So example undesirable result statements would be, and now we're going to be adding in this combination of minimum thresholds. This one looks familiar. It's groundwater levels in more than 10% of wells fall below their respective minimum thresholds. It's like that example, except for it's 10 instead of 20%. Another one could be any groundwater quality representative monitoring points quality is worse than minimum thresholds for any constituent of concern. Now the difference between these two is the one has got this flexibility built in that 10% could be below minimum threshold, and the other one is none of them can be below the minimum threshold. So there's not really a combination. It's just if you exceed the minimum threshold, then it's undesirable. Okay, next would be minimum thresholds, and you kind of have to develop the minimum thresholds and the undesirable results kind of in tandem there. But I think you're clear of what minimum thresholds are, and the staff would come to you with a technical approach of how we plan to determine what those elevations or quality or concentrations would be, and we would get our cues from significant, unreasonable, and undesirable results. So we need to hear from you what you think about that, what direction you think you're going before we can come to you and say this is how we propose to look at how we propose to develop our minimum thresholds. And for say the example of groundwater levels, we would look heavily at historical groundwater conditions, so that blue line that's going up and down. Have a look at what was happening, what was demand like that then, what was the water year type like, was it dry, was it wet, and we would find an elevation for each of the representative monitoring wells. But that approach that we take, we would run it by you to get your input on that first. And so then we develop the thresholds at each representative monitoring well, and there's a bit of iteration between those two criteria. The next is measurable objectives, and that's where we want to be. We aspire to be, and finally we're allowed to say what we want. It's not what we want to avoid or where we don't want to be, it's now where we want to be. And this is the higher line that we need to try and be at by the end of the first 20 years of GSP implementation. And it's important to note that that objective is not enforceable, but it must be achievable. You don't want to set something so high that you would never achieve it. Then it's not really an objective that makes sense. And again, we would come to you with an approach of how we plan to come up with those measurable objective numbers. And we develop them for each of the wells. So then the interim milestones, so the little orange diamonds there, this is one of them where we won't get your input, we'll just show you the results because it comes from the model, because no one other than the model is going to know what the future holds. So, so once we've agreed on the projects and management actions, then we run the model for out into time. It'll be like for 50 years we have to run the model, and we would be able to pinpoint to some degree of accuracy what groundwater levels should look like at each of those points that are representative monitoring points, and that we have sustainability management criteria set. Well, and so I've given you a quick rundown, and I'm not getting into too much detail of each indicator and how we would go about it, because that would be just too much. I'm just taking it off in chunks. And the first chunk is going to be later tonight, will be the looking at the degraded groundwater quality. But if you wanted to read more, DWR brought out a document here, best management practices for SMCs. But I have to tell you, there's like a it's very minimal. They really didn't give much guidance, and we've had to learn just by doing. So if you were interested, there's a link. Okay. Questions, and particularly I did forget to stop when it came to the undesirable results. So if you have any other questions and you want to go back and discuss some of the slides.
We'll start with the board, yes.
Thank you. I have a couple questions. You mentioned something called adaptive management. It sounds like we learn as we go along, we're able to amend the plan.
Yeah.
So could we, I'm not saying we would do this consciously, but it almost sounds like if we're not meeting our minimum thresholds or meeting our goals, we could reduce them as we go along, and could we conceivably just keep reducing them over the whole span in a worst case? I'm not suggesting we do that, but I'm trying to understand, are there limits to what the adaptations could be?
Who knows? No one's done it yet, so we can test them, but no, I wouldn't. No, you know, if you were to change it, you would be probably changing your statement of significant unreasonable as well.
Mm-hmm.
And you'd have to have good reason to do that. So I believe if you had good reason to do that, then you could. But and so, you know, in other basins we've worked in, it's been this, and we will grapple with this too when we start trying to figure out these numbers, is do you make it really difficult to get to and run the risk of not being sustainable, or do you bring it down? And so it's almost you bring it down to the, and this is what the hope was when DWR establishes, is that you set that level at a level that's manageable and that that doesn't cause harm to the basin. That's all they want to do. If they see that you bring that level down to where there's harm to the basin, they won't let you do it.
Right.
Yeah, because they want you to make that decision, because only this basin knows what harms it. Someone in Sacramento doesn't know that, but they have their tools. They have all sorts of little tricks that they use to evaluate these GSPs, and so they'll know.
Okay.
I would assume adaptive management had to do with the solutions we found to any situations that we, not really changing the criteria, but just changing our approach.
Okay, which might change the criteria somewhat.
It's both.
Well, improve, hopefully.
Yeah, okay. I have one other question. That is, you used a couple examples of 10% and 20%. Were those arbitrary, or are those in a range that would be deemed reasonable? In other words, could we, for instance, say that no more than 50% would be below the
Yeah,
minimum
you could do
threshold?
that. I've seen another GSPs, I think up to 30%, I don't know 50%, but there's ramifications for that, which when we are talking in detail about that indicator and what I will tell you what the good and bad about that is. Yeah.
Thank you.
Doug?
Again, thanks for the presentation. I'd like to spend a little bit of time on this measurable, the management area, management flexibility area between measurable objectives and minimum thresholds. You use the term achievable but unenforceable about the measurable objectives. So just to be clear, can we achieve sustainability without achieving the measurable objective as long as we're above our minimum threshold?
Yes.
Okay.
So that's how undesirable results or significant unreasonable conditions result when you go below that. And that's where when we establish the minimum thresholds, we have to be very clear, will that really cause significant unreasonable conditions? Or is it something we would just like to have, you know? So.
Okay. Thank you for that. The other question I had to do with these interim milestones. I'm imagining it's not just an instant in time, but you've got some sort of a time window around when you're taking measurement of, let's say, groundwater levels or something like that. Is that a fair assumption on my part?
Yeah, because when we come up to the undesirable results, we might want to say it's the average annual groundwater levels or the average monthly, and that's how you build the flexibility in. It doesn't have to be a percentage like this. It can be that you have some statistic to kind of soften that number a bit, right? So places that have used 30%, interestingly, are like big ag basins in the Central Valley that have said, 30% of their wells could go dry, and that's okay. So, but that's what they decided. Other places have said, we will, in the first 20 years, we'll let the water levels drop 100 feet, 200 feet, and we're okay with that. But every basin is different. But they then were hoping to glide up, or whatever they planned.
Anyone else from the board? Okay, and I'll take questions from the general public, but just in case, I did not really introduce Georgina King. She works for Montgomery & Associates. She's a senior hydrogeologist. She has several letters after her name. Talking about. So, just in case you haven't been here before and haven't had the pleasure of hearing Georgina speak. So, has anyone out here have any questions? Sean?
Georgina, these collections of information about a test well.
Yeah.
And so each one is going to have its definition. And do we already have all of our test wells in place? And do they cover each of the layers of that basin?
We will be using wells that exist. There are some data gaps which we have to identify and fill, and there is grant money to do that in this basin, so that's good.
Great.
So I hope that answers your question. So there are some, and there's more coming. Because the wells, I've talked to you about this before, the wells are not evenly distributed throughout the basin. Like a plum pudding. They're kind of clustered together. So.
But they do measure area, the effect.
They go through the
area.
whole.
Yeah.
Like you explained.
Yeah.
Yeah, that they'll cover each area that we need to cover.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's.
And I'll go to your estimation if they go through all of the different layers of the aquifer also.
Well, you don't want them to go through all. You want it to just be screened in the one. You don't want it to be kind of getting a bit from one aquifer, a bit from another. That gives a skewed result.
You have separate wells
Yes.
for different depths.
Correct. Yes. And we will be talking to you. I'm starting to work on the monitoring network that we're going to use and selecting which are going to be representative monitoring wells. So that's something that I'll talk to you about in the next few months.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Bruce Holloway.
Thanks. I didn't hear you say test wells, because you said most of these wells exist. That's not going to be a test well where you go stick a hole somewhere. Okay, so I know that the two districts, that have the biggest wells in the basin, from time to time have well failures. So that's, so then they just abandon that well, I guess, and they go try to find an equivalent somewhere nearby. So that's one question is, when you pick these particular wells, you standardize on them, and eventually, over 20 years, some of them are going to disappear, so you have to replace them. How do you do that in a way that you don't get the wrong story? Where every time you replace it, you're thinking that things are getting better or things are staying the same when actually things are getting worse because you're going further. Anyway, things like that when you replace the well. So that's one question. And then I guess, okay, so it seems to me with my car, when I stick the dipstick in for oil, I'm supposed to do that when the engine's not running. But if I'm measuring transmission fluid, I think I'm supposed to do that when the engine is running, or when so there could be a big difference, I imagine, if you're pumping 24 hours a day and then you measure the water level right now, or if you let it go for a week or a month or something and go back and measure that level, because there's a cone or something that you're sucking from the bottom of a cone, and so once you stop pumping, it's going to rise. So what are the standards there? Do you
there are standards.
Do you rest it for a while? How do you correlate over 20 years so that you know that there's been comparable results?
Right. Yeah, so the first question will answer part of your second question. My first answer will answer part of the second question, and that is that the wells that we will select will hopefully not be pumping wells. They're monitoring wells. They're purely stores in the ground to measure groundwater levels. And some of these are close to production wells, and some of them are not. And so when we decide on which ones to use, we take all of that into consideration. We will not select production wells for groundwater levels for the very reason you said, because they're going to be pumping. And if we select a monitoring point that is nearby one, that is influenced by a fair bit, we would probably, when we take, they're also going to be equipped with data loggers, so you'll be able to see when other wells are pumping, because you take readings every hour or so, and you'll be able to see the influence. It is definitely something that we have to consider when we establish these thresholds, especially if there's not much of a space between the minimum threshold and the measurable objective. But I hear your concerns, and that is something and I said in a few months when we talk about the representative monitoring wells, I'll give recommendations of the wells that we'd like and why we would like them, and add in, and the new wells that we're putting in are away from production wells.
Okay, I've got another quick question, I guess. It's down here. Where is it here? Are there any other criteria other than groundwater level in a finite number of wells? Any other criteria, measurable criteria that the agency might develop?
Quality. Yeah. And then we also need to know all the production is one of the other things we need to know, how much is being pumped from the basin. And so all the municipal wells have meters, and we make estimates of the non-metered production. Unless they're volunteers to put meters on their wells in the private.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. Anyone else? Yes.
You're modeling out 50 years. Is that model based on historical data? Because you and others think that in the next 50 years, the weather patterns are going to change significantly. So how would you update that going forward?
Right, so we make our best guesses going forward. So we're going to take into account climate change and projected demands in the basin, and do the best that we can. all the agencies have to plan for the future, and they're used to doing this kind of forecasting. I think they'll also tell you it's not always right, but everyone knows that, and we'll do the best that we can. But we do use historic data to calibrate the model to make sure that we're doing a good job matching what we know happened, and that means that we are more confident that it will be able to predict going forward if we got the climate and the demand right. But that's why there's adaptive management, because no one knows what's going to be in the future.
Thank you. Good question. Anyone else? Okay, thank you. So we have our next big bite.
Okay, here I come again. Here I am. Very nice to see you.
Could I just quickly add for those people that it might be their first meeting? We try to put all of the presentations up on the website ahead of the meeting, so if any of you have mobile devices that you want to follow along, feel free to, next time when you come, bring them, and it's sometimes a little bit easier because there's a lot of information.
Okay, so now I'm going to try and give you a better idea about groundwater quality in the Santa Margarita Basin. And we only know about what the quality is like because people take samples. Oh wait, first, there's a series of three presentations here. And I'm going to talk about all part of this groundwater quality section. I'm going to talk about background. Rosemary's going to talk about federal and state water policy. And then I'm going to start the process of talking about significant unreasonable degraded groundwater quality with you. Okay. So, but for us to make any decisions about groundwater quality, we need to understand what the groundwater quality is in this basin, if there's any issues or if everything's just fine. So we only know what groundwater quality is like because of samples taken. And for safe drinking water, the municipal wells are tested, small water systems are tested, and private wells are tested. There is routine testing that's required by the state. And the water districts report every year. They have to let people know who are using their water what the quality was like. There's these really interesting reports. I always enjoy reading them. Consumer confidence report. You should read that, and it'll tell you, what's in your water, and they need to comply. If they are exceeding standards, they have to treat that water. The county requires all private wells, new private wells that go in, that they have to test for TDS, chloride, and nitrate, and they also have to test for iron and manganese now. That only started in 2013. Then the small water systems, those are those that supply more than 5 connections, and if it's between 5 and 14 connections, then they have to report quarterly bacteriological and one-time testing of inorganics. And if it's a bigger small water system up to 199 connections, they have to report water quality to the county every 1 to 9 years, and I think that depends on their first sample, maybe.
Well, it depends on the constituents. There's different sampling frequencies for different constituents.
Okay, so that's where our data comes from, is testing production wells, but also the districts have put in a lot of money to put in these monitoring wells that I was talking to you about around, because they need to manage their resource, and just monitoring the production wells is not enough. You've got to put wells around that source in the basin. So we have data from that as well. And so what I'm going to present to you is from those data. You're going to hear things like primary drinking water standard or maximum contaminant level. That's very technical. I'm going to try and stick with the more lay term of primary drinking water standards. And this is a standard that the state or federal government sets because it has that chemical or that constituent has an adverse effect on human health. It's really important. And in this basin, I'll show you which ones have primary drinking water standards, and then many of them actually in this basin only have secondary drinking water standards, and that's levels that are set or concentrations set because they're not health threatening, but they are recommended for aesthetic reasons. So, for example, iron and manganese might stain your laundry, so you won't, and it tastes a bit metallic. You're not going to die from it, but there's a standard for it. So the good news is water quality in the basin is pretty good, and better off than many other basins in the state. And not very often are primary drinking water standards exceeded. But there are some constituents of concern that we look out for. There's naturally occurring, and then there's anthropogenic, or ones introduced by us into the basin. So on the naturally occurring, iron and manganese is kind of ubiquitous throughout the basin. It's treated by the municipalities, and Dale, do you treat for iron and manganese?
No, our level is pretty low.
Okay, so if they're exceeding the secondary standard, they get treated. It's a filtration. Arsenic is also found in parts, and I'm going to show you where these are found. But that gets treated coincidentally with iron and manganese in the filtration. Then total dissolved solids, which is related to salinity. It's a measure of salinity. It's pretty good in this basin, but there are a few little hot spots where we see higher levels. Then on the anthropogenic side, nitrate is one of the major constituents of concern, as well as VOCs, volatile organic compounds. I'll go into those with you, but it's mostly from, say, dry cleaners or like degreasing or paint shops and things like that. And then there's MTBE, which is to do with gas station, gas additive. And I'm going to show you on a map where we find these. It's very limited. It's a small map. Thank goodness. Let me see. So I'm really, because the quality is pretty good, I'm really only going to point out the areas that are a little different from the norm. TDS and chloride have only secondary drinking water standards. And up in the top right there, you'll see what those standards are. It's 1,000 milligrams per liter for TDS and 250 for chloride. So in this, the area I'm circling is where we have data, and these are production wells in the Quail Hollow area, and everything's great there. It's good quality. In another area, just to the south of it, in the same aquifer, these wells have slightly higher TDS and chlorides, and this is to do with the geology. So they're both Santa Margarita Formation screened wells, but the one to the second one I clicked on there to the south is influenced by overlying mudstones, which dissolve. There's minerals are dissolved out of there when recharge water flows through them down into the Santa Margarita that the wells are screened in, so they have slightly higher. I think it's probably tastier water. I don't know, but you know, people buy mineralized water from Perrier and whatever, and so it's still considered very good water. In Scotts Valley area, in Lompico and Butano area, also similar. It's also had some sediments that have been mineralized out, and so but the concentrations are all well below the drinking water standards. There's one place where we have data, and where the concentrations are fairly high, and this is a well screened in the Monterey Formation, which is it's below the Santa Margarita, and it's a shale, and it was deposited in a marine environment, and so it's well known throughout the Central Coast to have some saline water in it. And so in the upper part, I think it doesn't have as much because there are quite a few wells that are are private wells that pump from that. But if you go down deep, and I'm going to show you on the next slide what happened when this well was pumped and groundwater levels in the area dropped. You've got, this is what happened. So the orange red line is the chloride concentration. You can see, well, that increased over time. And it went over 1,000 milligrams per liter, and the secondary level there is 250, so it's well over. But if you look at it in comparison to the blue line, which is groundwater levels, in the 80s there was or 90s there was an extended drought, plus there was big population growth in the area, and so that's why you're having the groundwater level drop 200 feet there. But as that level dropped and this well was pumped more, this is the water level in this well. As its water level dropped, it went deep into the Monterey where the saltier water was and started pulling that in. And so this is an example of significant unreasonable. You do not want to cause this. But this is the only well that we have data for and that we know that this has happened. And I don't think John has had too many other reports of salty wells other than in some areas that the wells are screened in the Monterey. So moving on to iron and manganese, which is quite widespread, and treatment of iron and manganese is common. Again, in the Santa Margarita, in this area, the Quail Hollow area, it's great, no iron and manganese problems. And the area just south of it, where there's more mineralization, there's a little bit more iron and manganese. And in the Monterey Formation, that one I just showed you the chart of, that actually is below secondary standards there. But in the Lompico Formation, in the Scotts Valley area, the iron and manganese is higher. But this is nothing that you've done in the basin, it's naturally occurring. And so they treated it up to 6 milligrams per liter. And all their wells are treated for that. In the deeper parts of the Lompico and the Butano, the very deepest aquifer of the basin, there's generally it's below drinking water standards. Every now and again it might spike up, but it's nothing consistent. So it's not too bad. In Mid-County Basin, they also treat, all the municipal wells are treated for iron and manganese. Arsenic. Now, this one has a primary drinking water standard, obviously, and is also naturally occurring in the basin. Fortunately, really only in the Lompico area, in the Scotts Valley area within the Lompico aquifer. And it's more than 2 times the drinking water standard. And so when they treat for iron and manganese, they filter out the arsenic as well. So that's not too much of a problem. Nitrate is one of the anthropogenic contaminants in the basin, and that is fairly widespread. All the others I was showing you are kind of, they're generally good, but there are some hot spots with nitrate because of the number of septic systems in the basin, which are represented by those, by all those little purple dots or pink dots. There's a lot of septic tanks. The city of Scotts Valley being the only sewered area, but still having a fair bit of septic tanks operational. Nitrate is found in many of the wells. So let's see. In this area over here, the levels. Oh, I should point out that the drinking, and this has a primary drinking water standard, is 10 milligrams per liter. Nitrate as N, and throughout the basin, nothing exceeds that. So that's good. But there is this compounding effect, which I'll talk about. So, you're below 3.6 milligrams per liter, less than half the standard in this area that was circled. In the Scotts Valley area, where the aquifers are deep, that they pump deeper aquifers that have a protective barrier above it, being the Monterey, there's almost always non-detect, and every now and again there might be a little bit that gets in. Private wells in the area, up to 6 milligrams per liter, and that kind of makes sense because they have septic tanks and their own wells on a small parcel close to each other, but still not anything that's going to cause harm. Let's see. So like I said, nitrate is not currently exceeding any of these drinking water standards, but the nitrate in the groundwater is contributing to elevated concentrations in the San Lorenzo River. And in the 90s, it was recognized that San Lorenzo River nitrate was increasing. It had been increasing since the 1980s, and it really is related to how many people were living here and the proliferation of septic tanks. And they realized that some of the basin objectives, water quality objectives, were going to be exceeded. So the city of Santa Cruz, being reliant on the San Lorenzo River, has done studies along with the county to figure out where the nitrate's coming from. But they also did this TMDL study, which is the total maximum daily load that you can allow in the river. When they did that document when was that document done?
It was completed in 1995.
That's right. Okay. And then at that point they said in 2020 nitrate should be at 0.34 milligrams per liter in the river at Felton, and in the average from 2011 to 2018 is a little higher than that. So I'm not sure what we're like in 2020, but it's probably slightly over the target that they have there. So I'm not sure what the next steps are. But this is just pointing out that there is this, even though there is no exceedance of drinking water standards in the groundwater, there are ramifications in the river. And part of that study that was done in 1995, they looked at the different sources of nitrates in the river, and they found that septic systems in total was about 57% of all nitrate in the river came from septic systems. There are other sources like fertilizer, livestock, stables. There was existing nitrate plume in Scotts Valley, and then sewer discharges that were known, and natural sources as well. So another thing is that over 50% of all the nitrate sources come from the sandy areas of Santa Margarita. So that's the most vulnerable of the aquifers, and then contributes to the nitrate in the river. 67% of nitrate sources are from septic systems in sandy soil, so makes sense. The nitrate is very conservative. It doesn't bind up in the soils very well. It just flows through without attenuating, and it gets into the groundwater and surface water much easier than some other constituents might. Okay, so the sources, the septic tanks, all the pink dots. Then there are homes with shallow bedrock, and so the septic systems don't work very well up, and it's out of the basin, just out of the basin in Boulder Creek Country Club area. And then I also discovered in the 80s, Scotts Valley Water Reclamation Facility used to just dump all their effluent into the quarries. And so I think that was the Scotts Valley nitrate plume that they were talking about. It wasn't pure sewage, it was effluent after the treatment, but in those days the standards weren't as strict as they are now. So these are sources, and you can see in that little cartoon there inside of the map about the septic tank, and John's going to talk more about this, what they're doing to improve that. But the way a septic system is constructed, it overflows into a leach field that eventually that liquid will get down into groundwater, and it has a lot of nitrate in it. So it's a well-known mechanism. And if the septic tanks are not well sited or they're not strict enough standards, it can cause quite a bit of trouble. And this is what it looks like in groundwater. So these are a number of wells, nitrate plotted on a chart. And there are different colors for different aquifer units, and within each aquifer you might have different concentrations. I'll explain that to you in a second. And what's clear though is that there's been increases that correspond with that population increase in the 1980s. And so as more houses had septic tanks put in, then the nitrates spiked. But realize this is still all below the drinking water standard. But nevertheless, you see this increase around in the 80s. And the orange, very hard to see, but the orange and brown lines are the Quail Hollow wells. One is a shallow well, shallower than the other. So the higher line is actually the shallow well in the Santa Margarita, and right next to it is a well that's screened a little deeper. It's got more protective depth to it, and it has lower nitrates in it. The Lompico Formation is this one here, the pink line, and that almost all non-detects, and just one spike there. That looks like that. I'm not sure, maybe a sampling error or something like that. But the vulnerable units are anything that are not have a protective barrier over it. So the Santa Margarita is open to whatever happens on the surface. So that's the most vulnerable, and it shows in the trends that you see there. This is about the only trend that we see in the entire basin of all water quality. That one TDS one that I showed you with well 9 and the Monterey. Those are the only two trends we can find. Otherwise, everything's pretty consistent.
What is that well in the Monterey Formation?
Well 9. Scott Valley Water District's well 9. It's not used anymore.
Okay, right. I didn't think so. Okay.
So John.
I get to talk about septic systems a little bit because we just wanted to let you know that even though they're a pretty significant source of nitrate.
If I just may, if anyone doesn't know the man here, that's John Rippers, County of Santa Cruz.
And when Georgina refers to the they who developed this TMDL back in 1995, that was mostly me. So
you're responsible.
I am familiar with the topic. Yeah, I am responsible. Now I'm responsible for trying to fix it. Septic systems they have pluses and minuses. They contribute to the recharge of the basin. We figured that probably during the dry period, maybe 50% of the flow in the San Lorenzo River came through a septic system. So water goes into the septic system, percolates down into groundwater, and then makes it to the river. So the city of Santa Cruz has been drinking recycled water for quite a while. But you need to have the septic systems working well so that they're not also contaminating or making the water unfit or unhealthy. When we look at the nitrate levels, again, most of the nitrate is coming from those septic systems in the sandy soils. The rest of the septic systems in the valley don't put out all that much nitrate. The nitrate is treated by the soil and by the vegetation and by the river itself provides treatment. So we have that objective for the river in Felton. The river already meets that objective down to about Ben Lomond before you hit Love Creek. And then as soon as you get into the sort of the Glen Arbor, Quail Hollow area where you get into the sandy soils, the nitrate levels go up significantly. A significant amount of nitrate coming out of Newell Creek, out of Bean Creek, and out of Zayandi Creek. So those are all the areas with the sandy soils where the nitrate percolates down into the groundwater and then eventually feeds into the river. There is quite a bit of natural treatment still, even in those sandy soils. There's probably at least 50% nitrogen removal. It doesn't all make it to the river, but enough of it does that we do exceed the standards right now. So some of the things that we're doing, we adopted a wastewater management program back in 1995, the county in conjunction with the Regional Water Quality Control Board, to basically go in and look for failing septic systems throughout the San Lorenzo watershed, to have those systems upgraded to a higher level of standard than what they were installed initially. And then if they can't meet those standards, to use enhanced treatment methods, where you actually put in a little mini treatment plant that can either just reduce the organic compound, provide the equivalent of secondary or tertiary treatment, or actually have a denitrification component where it removes the nitrogen, much of the nitrogen before it goes into the ground, to reduce that nitrogen discharge into the groundwater basin. So those are some of the things we're doing right now. We're working with the regional board right now to sort of review where we're at. We're supposed to meet that target in 2020. We're in 2020 and we haven't met that target in the middle portion of the river. So we're discussing with the regional board what the best approach would be. It may be requiring more enhanced treatment systems throughout those sandy areas. Maybe the way that we go on that.
John, where did we start back in 1995 when our goal was 0.34 and now it's 0.48?
We were pretty much at 0.48. It's been pretty flat since from the 80s through now. It goes up and down. Some years it's up, some years it's down. We thought we had a nice trend coming off the 90s. There was a drought in the 90s when the nitrate levels were higher, when we adopted the nitrate management plan, and it went down for a while, but then it came back up. So it fluctuates. It hasn't gone up significantly, but it also hasn't gone down. But we have something like 500 enhanced treatment systems installed now in the San Lorenzo watershed, either for nitrogen removal or just to accommodate site constraints like shallow groundwater or inadequate root or poor soils. Another thing that I should mention that relates to sort of the rate of new development or new sources of nitrate is we do have a restriction in place in the San Lorenzo watershed where no new development can take place on a parcel less than 1 acre in size. So we have a lot of parcels out there that are not buildable because they don't meet that 1 acre minimum. That's a fairly stringent restriction that you don't see that much in other locations, but that was put on in the 80s mostly as a concern over nitrate levels in the river to reduce any increased cumulative impact. So there are a number of programs that are in place and that we're continuing to pursue. So, did you want to take it over? Are there any other questions on Bruce?
Yeah, there was a point when you were talking about 50% nitrate reduction as basically the septic effluent is making its way through sandy soils of the river. So one question is, what's the mechanism that's taking up nitrate? And then in the pie chart, there were natural sources as well as septic. So, I mean, I guess we've got fish and birds, wildlife out there. But I mean, what are the natural sources and what are the natural mechanisms that might reduce the nitrate?
Couple of things. One of the natural sources is rainfall. You end up with nitrate in rainfall, particularly as we're close to the ocean. The concentration of rainfall can be as high as 0.3, so you're almost exceeding the standard just in the rainfall. In many situations, the soil and the vegetation will either break it down or take it up, convert it to plant material. I mean, we all fertilize our gardens to make them grow better and produce more vegetables. So those plants need and use and remove the nitrogen from the soil. But just like the sandy soils are leaky for septic systems, they're also leaky for natural sources of nitrate. So there is more natural, the level of natural nitrate in sort of a natural condition in a sandy system is going to be higher than the level of nitrate in groundwater in a more fine, where there are fine soils. The nitrate's removed essentially by soil organisms. Soil organisms, and to some extent dilution, but mostly the soil organisms. First, the nitrogen gets converted to nitrate in the presence of oxygen, and then when you get into an anaerobic condition where there's not oxygen, like down into groundwater or in the riparian soils, there's a different kind of organism that does denitrification, and those organisms convert the nitrate back to atmospheric nitrogen. The atmosphere is what, 70% nitrogen. So there's a huge amount of nitrogen in the atmosphere. What we're concerned about is that little component that's in our soils and moving to our groundwater. And ideally what we do is we either have treatment mechanisms or we create the soil conditions that promote that denitrification process to get the nitrogen back into the atmosphere. Any other questions? All right, back to Georgina. A brief break.
That's your chemistry lesson for today. Okay. So now, the volatile organic chemicals or compounds and pesticides, these are, what we know as contamination sites that can come from gas stations, dry cleaners, like I said. So there's this database that the state has of all the cleanup that's going on, any part of the state. And for this area, the bigger colored dots that you see are contamination sites. The historic, the green ones are ones that the case is closed, and there's orange ones and yellow ones there as well. Hard to see, but they are, and they concentrate around Scotts Valley. There's the Watkins Johnson Superfund site. There's 2 dry cleaners being cleaned up right now, and there's a former lumber company that's in Felton. Otherwise, it makes sense where these cases of contamination have occurred is where there is more industrial and built up areas in the San Lorenzo corridor and then in Scotts Valley. But there are no gas stations at the moment that are leaking or have open sites, but this can always change. And so this is something we can't control very much, but Rosemary's going to talk a lot about some of the regulations regarding this. So all the municipal wells are sampled for VOCs. It's a very long list. Hundreds and hundreds of chemicals are tested for. And of all of them, all of the production wells, this is a list of all the municipal production wells in the basin, and 3 of them have had hits of some kind of VOC. I'll show you on the map what that looks like. So in Quail Hollow that we've been talking about, the topmost one there, in the 90s, there's already hits of PCE and MTBE, and there's no real contaminating activity around there, so what could that be? And the San Lorenzo Valley Water District's hydrogeologist at the time reported that it could just take someone spilling half a gallon of degreaser or something like that, or doing some work on their car and putting that into the ground that would cause those low levels they're in the parts per billion, and but it's still I don't think you treated that, Rick, is that right? They were still below, they were just a test.
There was a test.
Just a test, so they weren't over the primary drinking water standard for those, but they were detected at very low levels. Scotts Valley Water District has well 11A with this chlorobenzene. Again, not very sure, it could be the same thing. That chlorobenzene is a degreaser. It could be in the house, it could be used by a household. But the one in the well 9, which is the one that I was talking about in the Monterey, it has, that is not pumped anymore. One is, it's got high TDS, but it also has been impacted by the still ongoing contamination sites. They're not completely sure which it is because they're all kind of together. It's Watson Johnson and then the dry cleaners, but it has had detects as well. Let me see, in this one here, they're below, all of them are below the drinking water standard, but nevertheless they're detects. And that's it for this basin, and the county regulates some of this stuff, and we hope they continue to do a good job. Okay. And what's important here is that we need to identify these, because when we implement the GSP and we put in measures to projects and management actions to achieve sustainability, we have to make sure that we don't move these plumes around if there are plumes still existing, because then by implementing the GSP you're causing degradation of water quality, and we'll talk about that more as coming up here after Rosemary's talk. Then there's this thing called contaminants of emerging concern, and you may have heard about those, or they're also called CECs, and these are constituents for which there are no regulations yet, and they include the pharmaceuticals and personal care products, and these have been detected in very low levels in the surface water of this basin. They are not found in the groundwater, and I would have assumed that the pathways for them would be similar to nitrate, but maybe because they are not found in groundwater, whereas nitrate is, maybe they bind up to the soil a little differently than nitrate would. And so in San Lorenzo River, they found things like sweeteners, antibiotics, DEET, foaming agents, other prescription drugs. So these are the things, these are the contaminants of emerging concern that have been found. And this is not regular sampling. People don't just go and take a sample and do this. The state, because they know that, well, there's no regulations, and they set these sampling events for all the water suppliers in the state to take to have an idea of what their CECs, because when regulations come out, they need to know how to act on that, what they're going to do if they're exceeding. These are very, very low levels, I have to admit. So to summarize water quality in the basin, naturally occurring constituents, iron and manganese, mostly in the Lompico. This is secondary standard. It's treated. Arsenic in the Lompico as well, so the Lompico is not doing too well there, but still better than some parts of the county. And TDS is generally good below, except in the Monterey. Contamination has affected nitrate, this is the big one, and then CECs not found in groundwater. Organic compounds, low levels, below primary drinking water standards. But we never know what could happen in the future, right? So we should be vigilant about that. So any other questions on groundwater quality background? Do you think you have a better understanding of what the water quality looks like in the basin now? If anyone was to ask you. Yeah. Good?
Yeah.
We can pass our pop quiz.
Okay, any questions from the board? Right. Any questions from anyone in the audience? Please.
There was a report, it was October 1st, 2019, at the Superfund site, where they sampled 12 wells, and 9 exceeded the PCE threshold for the clean water.
Right. So yeah, they've been wanting to close that for a long time and pushing, but their trick is to quickly close up all their monitoring wells, hoping that no one would be able to see then what's happening. But thank goodness the regulatory agencies kept those wells going. And yeah, it's come back, so they have to revisit it. Yeah, it's very strict rules. You know, they think they can't allow that to happen. So they were hoping to be closed, but no. And a lot of it is there are vapors that are caught up in the soil. So like the dry cleaners, they also thought they were done, but they have to address the vapors that are in the soils, because anything that's built above it, it can be those vapors can go and get into the building, and so there's a lot of studying that. In fact, the school is closed in Oakland High School because of that right now.
Anyone else? Okay, now we have fun federal and state.
I'm only going to do this a long time to give Georgina a break. Otherwise, we can go to the end and read the last slide. Okay. So really, the purpose of this presentation, which you can find on the website, is deep background. The takeaway message is there is a mass of both federal and state regulatory parameters that water utilities, wastewater utilities, anybody who's dealing with these water supply issues have to comply with, and these have been in place for decades. And so there is no kind of anything goes kind of opportunity here. It's a very highly regulated business that we're in, and certainly as we start to look at what we might do in terms of groundwater management on a going forward basis, this all is in the background and is assumed to be in place, and then it's whatever is the new stuff that comes along. And as Georgina talked to you already in the last presentation when she made a reference to maximum contaminant levels and primary drinking water standards and TMDLs, these are all came from both the federal and the state actions that I'm going to review relatively quickly with you. So let's see, I have a thing here, right? I have to do something with it. Like what? Press this button. That's good. So really the point is to provide you with the board and the public with just information on the statutory and regulatory framework, and to give you links so that you can keep this presentation or go back to it later on if you're saying, now tell me again what that thing about the Clean Water Act is that relates to the TMDL, and how does that work? There's links in here that you can go back to the legislation that creates that. One of there are two really key pieces of legislation that started us down the path of having a kind of standardized treatment of drinking water and clean water, rivers and streams, that happened in the early 70s. I think California's water quality thing actually happened before the Clean Water Act, but the Clean Water Act was a part of a suite of federal legislation that happened in 1970 when the National Environmental Protection Act got passed. The Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act came in 71, Clean Water Act in 72, the Safe Drinking Water Act in 74, there was a Toxic Substance Control Act, there was a Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which deals with Superfund sites. All these pieces of legislation came out of experiences that those of us of an age will remember, the Cuyahoga River being on fire, the Love Canal disaster, where a toxic waste dump was used as the basis for housing, and in the good old days, it was a Republican president who signed most of these things. I can't help but saying that at this point in the game. But these two pieces of legislation are really the foundation of the regulatory structure that drives what we do every day. I'm going to talk here very briefly. Clean Water Act. This was to establish, eliminate discharges of pollutants into the nation's waterways. Here in this basin, Chris Berry from my staff can tell you a story about the history of the San Lorenzo River and its use as a sewer for all of the development that took place in the basin, whether it was lime kilns, creating cement or tanneries or what have you. And all that stuff was dumped into the river and ended up down, in the ocean. And this was happening all over the country, and this Clean Water Act was attempting to put a stop to this. And then also to achieve water quality levels that are fishable and swimmable. You notice they didn't say drinkable here, but I guess they figured it was good enough for fish, it was good enough for us. And then to achieve that, there were a whole set of designated uses that got established. And so every stream in this country that's under the jurisdiction of a Clean Water Act, whether the state or federal version, has to have a designated use, and often multiple designated uses. And in the case of the San Lorenzo River, the driving designated use for that basin is cold water fishery. It's because it has the greatest and most sensitive requirements for dissolved oxygen, temperature, nitrogen, phosphorus in terms of nutrients, and that's the driver. It has other uses as well, but if you have cold water fishery designation on your river or your creek, then typically that's the one that is the most stringent. And this is the place where as a designated use, if you can't achieve the designated use because you don't have water quality that's good enough to meet that level of what's required, then you get a total maximum daily load. So that's where the nitrogen, that's the link between what was talked about in the last presentation and this presentation. And you can see what the designated uses are there. And in this basin, as I said, obviously we have a drinking water, public drinking water supply, but the real driver for the management of this river system is the designated use established for cold water fishery. The one really important thing that to talk about as it relates to both surface water and groundwater, and it exists in the federal policy, it exists in the state policy, is an anti-degradation policy. I'm going to talk a little bit about what that is. And this is really important because, all right.
You got it.
I think I'm going to do that, yeah. It's really important because it basically says you can't, you have to protect the quality of the existing uses, and they should be maintained. And if your quality is better than is what's minimally required, you can't let it degrade to the minimally required. You have to protect that. And this applies whether it relates to, as I mentioned, surface water or groundwater. So we can't just put water in the ground as a way to restore the aquifers if it will cause degradation to the water quality that's in the natural groundwater. So this is a really important parameter that has a lot to do with thinking about if we're going to do some kind of groundwater injection or recharge through things like infiltration basins or what have you. It has to meet a certain set of standards so that the groundwater is protected. The Safe Drinking Water Act, I'm going to move on here, maybe. Thank you.
If you start yelling slide, I'll figure it out.
Okay, thank you. Is a really important, obviously, for a drinking water agency, whether you're surface water or groundwater, has a lot of provisions in it for what we're intending to protect. And I think that the sort of two big takeaways for the Safe Drinking Water Act and kind of the public health framework that's behind it. One is that drinking water systems should be operated using a multiple barrier system. In other words, if you have good source water quality, whether it's surface water or groundwater, you need to protect that. That's barrier number one. Barrier number two is some kind of treatment process. Typically in a surface water system, that's a treatment technique that requires you to meet a certain set of requirements for how long your water is in contact with chlorine, or whether it's filtered or not filtered, and under what conditions you can treat it to go through to deal with microbial contaminants, which are an acute public health issue. We've done such a fabulous job in this country in treating drinking water to protect from waterborne disease that people don't actually think that it happens anymore. And I can tell you that if we start treating drinking water and using the kind of technologies that we have in place these days, especially surface water, we would have a lot of waterborne disease in this country again, cholera, typhus, etc. And the third one is in distribution system management and maintaining chlorine residual, and so that you have the ability to produce and deliver a quality product from the source to the tap. That's the basic framework. And then the second piece is really that on the other side of the parameters, besides the acute pathogens and microbial agents that you're treating for in surface water treatment, that you need to be looking at the more chronic, long-term exposure issues. And this is where a lot of the kinds of contaminants of constituents of emerging concern, the VOCs, these are all things that typically will have a long-term exposure, health risk associated with them that need to be managed, because people do drink 2 or 3 liters of water a day for a 7-year period, and if that happens and you're being exposed to the same thing day in and day out, you can have higher incidences of a variety of different, more chronically produced outcomes, cancer being the one that everyone looks at. So again, this is the Safe Drinking Water Act. It's been amended a couple of times, major amendments in '86 and '96. The most recent set of amendments came in the 2018 American Water Infrastructure Act, which were focused mainly on the lead and copper issues associated with that kind of came out of the Flint, Michigan problem. Without being redundant, without being redundant, California, these are the legislations that are quite similar with respect to California. The State Water Resources Control Board has an anti-degradation policy. The Porter-Cologne Water Quality Act, I believe this one came actually in front of the 1972 Clean Water Act. It was almost the model for that. So we were ahead on that, but it was again focusing on trying to fishable, swimmable, let's try not to pollute our water sources, our surface water sources in particular. And then we have drinking water regulation that comes out of the sort of health policies, and then more recently the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. These are the things that are associated with what we do in California and what we comply with in California. Okay. So the framework has to do with, I want to say this because I think it's really important. The actions are implemented on this water policy and regulatory framework are implemented by a lot of different agencies. Right now the State Water Resources Control Board has both the water right side of the house and the drinking water regulation side of the house. That used to be in the Department of Public Health under EPA, I think, but a few years ago it moved so that the quality and quantity were in the same place. Public Utilities Commission implements some of these pieces of regulation for regulated investor-owned drinking water entities. Cities, counties, special districts that produce and deliver drinking water are implementers of this. But I think it's really important to understand that that these provisions apply to the actions of this very long list of parties, including all those I just mentioned, plus individual well owners, property owners, farmers, etc. So it's very wide-ranging in terms of the power of these kinds of this regulatory framework in terms of who can be affected by this. And if you're a private well owner, it still doesn't give you the right to, you might have rights to take water, but you don't necessarily have rights to pollute the ground or what have you. So that's where some of this regulation comes from. I'm going to kind of quick skip through the next ones. And again, that you can use this as a reference guide. There's kind of the key points. California, the Porter-Cologne Clean Water Act version, like I said, adopted in '68. The Drinking Water Act integrated into the water code. A number of things. I think I want to move on to, I don't know, page 33 now. So I want to talk a little bit about recycled water and the statutes, because I think that's been on some people's minds about, okay, what's the regulatory framework for that? And so here you'll see that there are a number of statutes that are involved in California. Most of the feds don't really have a recycled water statute. There's some talk in EPA right now about developing that, kind of a little bit, you know, in the wrong order, because a lot of the states have already been doing a lot of work on getting recycled water, various kinds of regulations set in the state level. So having the feds do something now and kind of try to apply their big picture thing over the top of all of this seems a little crazy making to me, but what do I know? But there are a set of there are requirements related to what's called tertiary treated wastewater that can be used for non-potable reuse, irrigation, ag irrigation. Obviously this has been going on in Scotts Valley for a number of years, so the water coming out of the wastewater plant has been treated and then is being distributed to use on the medians and what have you. There's a whole set of regulations that have been developed over a number of years that are have been applied and are being applied. It's called indirect potable reuse. This is basically taking treated wastewater, tertiary treated wastewater, treating it at several additional steps of purification, and then using that to inject into the ground. You create an environmental buffer there, and that buffer helps to, before you take it out again. I know that's been also looked at here in Scotts Valley as a possible source of you know, a way of restoring, recovering some parts of the groundwater basin. And then there's a similar kind of piece of legislation that's been looking at taking that advanced treated wastewater and putting it into a surface water source. Loch Lomond would be our local version of what that would be. You would put it in there, it stays there for a period of time, and then it's brought back into the system, sent back to the Graham Hill Water Treatment Plant and delivered. These are the regulatory constructs, and they're not static. Go ahead. They have evolved over time. You can see that there was recycled water was first adopted in 2009 here in the state, a plan for how to deal with this. 2013 it was amended, and then 2016 further amended. And the drivers of most of the policy reviews have been looking at, you know, information on CECs in particular. How does that play into this? How do the treatment processes that are used for these advanced treated recycled water strategies deal with these kinds of small quantity trace contaminants, changes in the regulatory environment? Certainly the drought has had in California 13, 14, 15, 16 kind of had a huge effect on the state trying to encourage people to begin to, you know, consider recycled water reuse as a source of supply, because so many of the regular sources of supply were pretty hard hit in that situation. And so trying to figure out how to go into, you know, encouraging people. So these are the kinds of drivers of those changes to the policy framework. One more. And there is an ongoing process to, you know, support increased development of use of recycled water. I've mentioned that. Amend the recycled water policy to reflect these changes, recommendations of the CEC Science Advisory Panel that was put together by the state, findings of an evaluation of the challenges and benefit of salt and nutrient management plan development. This is recycled water tends to concentrate the salts in the stream that comes out, and then if you apply that either to the ground or what have you, or if you inject it into the ground, you can get the accumulation of these salts. And so one of the questions about managing that is how do you make sure the nitrogen and some of the other things that end up in these sources don't have negative effects down the road. And clarify, streamline, provide statewide consistency for permits, which makes things easier if you're going to want to do one of these things. I'm not going to talk so much about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act because you're all living that. But I think that in terms of some of the overlap and the connections here, I just want to say that, again, from the water quality parameter in particular, there's a lot of the data that has been collected, the things that are, give us the ability to tell the story about what's going on in this basin or the Mid-County Basin or wherever it is, have come from drinking water data collection and monitoring and management of these various water quality parameters. So probably in a lot of ways, this data set that you've just seen, the presentation about water quality conditions in the basin is one of the most robust ones that we have in this basin. So I think that's a good piece of information to keep in mind. And it came from this regulatory framework that's been in place a long time. And then last slide, which is, so the takeaways are, there's strong federal and state statutes and regulations governing water quality that will apply across the board to anything we would do in this basin. Anti-degradation policies are particularly important considering how projects under management actions we might use in this basin would be applied or developed or selected in order to support or improve sustainability. And then finally, federal and state statutes and policies on these things are not static, but are continuously evolving based on new information and experience. Happy to take your questions.
John Leopold.
Do we have any fear that federal action about recycled water might lower standards if they haven't or tried to in air quality standards?
I'm not too worried about that, and I think frankly, California is pretty darn invested in recycle as a pretty important strategy for the future of the state. So frankly, I think if that happened in this state anyway, they would be ignored.
Yeah, well, I mean, the air quality standards, we've had pretty high standards and set the pace for the rest of the country, and the Trump administration went after the state pretty hard. So
I think the one thing that they have, and I don't know about the air side so much, but quite a bit of the money that comes in to fund the drinking water SRF, the State Revolving Loan Fund, and the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund, and there's a third one now, I forget what it's called, but it's all sort of in there, is coming out of the feds. And of course, there's always that carrot and stick piece. If you don't do this, then you won't get that. And even though California, I think, has been probably more active than a lot of states in figuring out their own way to fund some of this kind of stuff through bond measures and other kinds of things, without the few billions that are coming in annually in these SRF funds, it's harder.
Yeah, I mean, I just think I don't know what the next 4 years are going to look like, but we've seen a level of policy dispute that I hope it doesn't extend to this area. I didn't know whether there was anything happening to you at the federal level. Sounds like no.
John.
Yes. We hear a lot about plastics in the environment, and so I haven't heard it discussed in our process so far, but I'm wondering, do we have plastic in our fresh water supply, and is that potentially under our purview?
I'm not aware of plastics research looking at surface water, at least on the scale of our systems. It's clearly an ocean issue. So I can't answer that question. So I can't.
You stumped her.
You did. Good question. Anyone else on the board? Okay. Anyone of our partners in the audience? Bruce?
Thanks. You and Mr. Ricker both pointed out that the city of Santa Cruz is essentially recycling wastewater in the San Lorenzo River. I've lived in SLP for most of my life, so those are my septic tanks.
Thank you very much.
So the city of Santa Cruz basically is practicing toilet to tap. It's de facto toilet to tap.
Indirect potable reuse.
Okay.
Imagine the
I mean, the
Mississippi
septic
River,
system
huh?
is
Well, that's,
good.
no, that's what I was gonna mention next, is, you know, the Mississippi River drains,
Yeah,
close to
absolutely.
half of the geographic area of the United States. And so all of those cities up and down the river have been, doing de facto toilet to town for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
But in California, so in a way, it seems like this is an area where California is behind the rest of the country, that accepts recycled water. And we can't seem to make it come together here. I mean, for example, Scotts Valley Water District would not be able to treat its wastewater and ship it to customers. I mean, there is recycled water in Scotts Valley, but it's not potable water.
Yeah.
It's being shipped to be drinkable. And in a way, I mean, I know there's people who just really would object to that idea, but to me, it's kind of a technological issue, technical issue. I took a tour of there's a recycled water plant over in San Jose.
Mhm.
That's a pilot plant, and they've got a plan for mixing the water and delivering it to ag users.
Yeah.
So they've got a way to use the water. But those engineers over there said, gosh, we just wish that there was a state standard. If there's a state, if there's a standard, the engineers will figure out how to meet it.
Yeah.
Any standard. A high standard, well, it may be expensive, and maybe people should not choose to do it. But if it's something that's achievable, then, anyway, it seems like, so what I'm really trying to understand here is, your water system uses, you're doing this, really. Scotts Valley can't. And,
Well, it's a different thing when you're taking it out of a natural system and pulling it into a treatment plant. I will say that one of the things John mentioned earlier in his presentation talked about the state of the nitrates in the river during the kind of early 90s, and the nitrate problem in the river coming from the septic systems in the valley was causing Santa Cruz a lot of issues with taste and odor problems in their drinking water, treated drinking water, and they made not huge, but they made a change to the treatment process to do some pre-oxidation with potassium permanganate in order to try to deal with that at the head of their treatment plant process. And I think that it is a very different thing if you're trying to say to someone, here's the loop between the wastewater plant and all this treatment, and then I'm putting it back into the system. It's different.
okay, but this leads to my follow-up question, because you were talking about, I think what I heard you say was, quote, Scotts Valley treated wastewater in Loch Lomond for a period of time, you said.
Yeah.
Some magic happens over time. I don't
A
understand what
solution,
that-
if nothing else, right? Solution, if nothing else, because it's not like, sequestered.
Well, okay, so when I asked the San Jose engineers about the Mississippi River, they said, yeah, it is about 7%. Throughout the whole river, it's around 7% treated wastewater.
More than that, probably, if you live in.
But it's a fraction, it's a small fraction,
Yeah.
really. So there's mixing going on in that system. But still, if it's good enough to drink, you should be able to ship it to a customer. And if it's good enough, sitting around in a lake, to me, doesn't make it.
I'm not recommending it, Bruce. I'm just saying that it's one of the things because of the various kinds of strategies. People want to do it in different ways, and I think that you got to realize that if it does happen, it's coming back and going through a regular surface water treatment plant again. That's not going to be putting in a big body of water.
Well, I'm fine with that, and if I lived in Santa Cruz, I'd be fine with that. But I guess what bugs me is, if you've got water that's not good enough to ship to a customer, and you're gonna inject it in our aquifer, I'm not behind that idea. If it's good enough to drink, ship it to a customer.
I'm not recommending that either. I'm basically saying this is a regulatory framework, and if we were to do something like that, we would choose how we want to make it look when it goes into the aquifer.
And I would just say that any plan we've ever talked about, I've ever seen at a water reuse conference, the water that would be injected in the ground wouldn't be good enough to ship to a customer. It would be potable water. The reason you would put it in the ground is because it would allow, well, first of all, I'm not sure all the regulations are in place yet, but on paper, that's just like those engineers told you in San Jose. They can make it just like, that's what the astronauts drink. What do you think they drink in space, right? So it would be good enough to drink, it's just that you would be another level of safety.
It's called an environmental buffer.
Environmental buffer by putting it in the ground, but it's not because it wouldn't be good enough to drink. And like you say, it would be arguably the same quality as something you would get that has been treated from water that has had to have been treated.
Can I say one more thing about this?
Sure.
Okay, so one of my forms of recreation is to go up in the wilderness, and you have to. I mean, the water's pretty clean up there. It's pretty hot. There's not anything really above it that's polluting it, but
Depends if the bears got into it first.
right. So you got to filter it, and one of the first times I took my daughter up there, she was only about 9 or 10, and I was showing her how you filter water, and she said, so, you know, that, I mean, she figured this out. She said, well, that filter's filtering out the bugs, you know, the Giardia or whatever it is I'm not supposed to drink. It's filtering that out, so eventually you're going to have to replace that filter, right? Well, you're nodding your head, but I don't want to replace the aquifer.
No, you have to replace the filters before you put it in the aquifer. Anyway, I digress. I'm not an expert. Thank you, Rosemary.
Thank you.
I assume there's no other questions for Rosemary. Okay, thank you.
Okay, if we're all still awake, we'll start to talk about what significant unreasonable degraded groundwater would look like in this basin. Maybe you have some ideas in your head swirling around. But let me talk, before we get into that, just a few things that builds on what Rosemary has said. This indicator, I have to explain a little bit more about this indicator because it's a little different than you would expect. It's a do no harm indicator of sustainability. That means that in implementing the GSP, you cannot make groundwater quality worse than it already is. You get that? So, and also the groundwater agency is not required to address past problems of groundwater quality. It can if it wants to. And it could take over management of that, but you know, there's multiple agencies been doing it for decades and with huge staff and huge budgets. It's not something I don't think any groundwater sustainability agency would want to take on. But you can, if you wanted to improve water quality, you would set higher objectives, but you need a means to improve that quality. So in your projects and management actions, you would need to have some projects that would have the results of cleaning the water up to that standard. Luckily, this basin is pretty good. You know, nitrates is the one thing we'll talk about at some point, and there are already things in place. And DWR wants to make sure that whoever is doing the cleaning up of anything, whether it be a gas station or septics, that the GSA knows what's happening, because it is responsible for achieving sustainability and water quality, and you can't be blindsided. But fortunately, the county is on the GSA, and Scotts Valley Water District and all the districts, actually, the San Lorenzo, the state reports to them when there are any contamination issues. So hopefully everyone is hearing about what the latest developments are in for example, Watkins Johnson, that they have to inform Scotts Valley Water District what's happening. So another thing is that the groundwater sustainability agency's authority over water quality, say you decided to take on that job, you cannot limit or supersede the authorities that Rosemary talked about already. So So I think, you know, that what you would probably focus on is doing no harm to the basin. In implementing the GSP, we want water quality to stay as it is. We do not want to do anything to cause harm, to degrade water quality. And what would degraded water quality do to the basin? So these are just a few examples. You could impair the drinking, the aquifer to the point where you now have to treat the water. Already they're treating for iron, manganese, these are natural things, but now I'm talking about human introduced things. You would require treatment. Say, you know, it would be onerous for private well owners to do treatment. You could have impacts to groundwater dependent ecosystems. You could change the quality of water in the streams. At the moment, I should point out the nitrate that is moving through the septic systems into the aquifer and into the streams. It's not, the nitrate is not at a level that would affect any aquatic species, is what I've read, at least. Then you could have impacts to overlying recreational land uses, and also to agriculture, which is limited in this basin. So these are examples of how, if you made your water quality worse, this is who you would impact. So how would implementing a GSP change water quality? Here's an example where there's a project implemented to achieve sustainability, and it causes the contamination footprint to get bigger. So if in, say, before the GSP, you have here a source of contamination with a plume, and you have a well next to it, but the well's okay because groundwater is flowing from right to left there, and it's no problem for that well to still be pumping. But now we go and put a big well in, and we're going to pump here because this is in the plan and this is what we've decided to do to achieve sustainability, and now the plume changes direction, and it's now flowing the other way because groundwater gradients have changed. And so this would be an example of moving the plume around because of something you've implemented in the plan. Okay. So what are we protecting? We have a good source of water here. There are these few constituents of concern that I've gone over. So these are all things to keep in your mind when we start talking about significant unreasonable. We're protecting our groundwater quality from these known contaminants, the plumes I mentioned, from Watkins-Johnson and dry cleaners, and then the nitrate from septic tanks. Potential sources, what water source are they going to, might be injected into the water, but like Rosemary pointed out, there's strict standards for this. You can't just throw any old water into the ground. And there's potential for future chemical spills or leaks. And then the naturally elevated quality, there's nothing, you might be able to move salinity, but you know, and you don't want to draw groundwater levels down so that you get that same trend happening in TDS like you saw in the well 9. Those are examples of things that you're protecting from. So things to consider also when we're talking about what significant unreasonable would look like in this basin is what level of degradation are we talking about, what constituents, who or what does the degradation impact the beneficial users of groundwater, and how long does it last? And next I'll go into some real examples of what other basins have said is significant and unreasonable to them. The Kern Basin is quite general, and this could apply actually to surface water, to ground. It could apply to water quality or groundwater levels, and they say water management actions. So in a significant unreasonable condition would be any water management action that affect the reasonable and beneficial use of and access to groundwater by overlying users. It's very general. Some statements are much more detailed, some are very short like this. In the Kiama Basin, this is quite a verbose one, but it a result stemming from a causal nexus between, I don't know if a hydrogeologist wrote that, but maybe a lawyer, I don't know, between sigma-related groundwater quantity, management activities, and groundwater quality that causes significant unreasonable reduction in the long-term viability of domestic, agricultural, municipal, environmental uses over a planning and implementation horizon of the,
That's a run-on sentence.
yeah. So, but they're pointing out who the users are, but they're saying that it's linked to the extraction of groundwater. It could be said very much more simply, as you'll see going on here. Pleasant Valley, they said degraded water quality resulting in a significant and unreasonable depletion of supply. Now, in my dealings with trying to come up with these, just saying significant and unreasonable is not good enough. You want to give a bit more, these ones, to me, they're like, oh, well, what's the next step? And then you've got to read something else to find out what the next thing is. So in our statement, it'd be good to try and say what significant and reasonable is. In the Korea Basin, they said unreasonable long-term changes of water quality concentrations from a baseline condition to significantly impact users of groundwater. Salinas, not too far from here, results in groundwater concentrations in a public water well above established maximum contaminant levels or secondary maximum contaminant levels, or leads to reduced crop production. That's a little bit more detail. Agricultural basin, so that's why they add that. And neighbor and mid-county groundwater quality attributable to groundwater pumping or managed aquifer recharge that fails to meet state drinking water standards. So they're all kind of the same. Well, some are more vague, but there are quite a few that point to these state drinking water standards. So that's what other people have said. And now, I'd like to find out what you think in this basin. And like I said, there's no right answer or wrong answer here. I would imagine you're trying to protect all users of groundwater, and you don't want to have to treat the water. It's already good. You want to maintain that. So that's why there's one group said they don't want it to get worse than the baseline, meaning the current conditions, pretty much. So who's going to have something to say what they think?
Who wants to write something up real quick? How do you want to go about this? Anyone have a starting point?
Well, my suggestion is we don't try to actually craft the exact words, but maybe if we just talked about the things that are most important to us, that'll be the ingredients to what
Right.
What
right.
we do.
And we do have a kind of a subcommittee is the wrong word, but a working group of wordsmithers that, if we gave them content and intention, they might be able to bring back
They
something.
are not a group, they are individual reviewers.
Individual
Who
reviewers.
the board chose not to have a group.
Right, not a
But they
subcommittee.
can all definitely work with the staff to find out the language.
Okay.
So what you're trying to do is you're trying to say what you want to avoid. So I'm sorry if it's kind of a negative thing, but it's what we don't want to happen in the basin.
Bruce.
Well, she just said that. I was just thinking of maintain the quality of water, very basically, of what we have.
Right.
And target the areas where improvements are needed as best possible. Very simple, but but if you say maintain, does that mean?
You don't want it to get worse.
Certainly don't want to ever, not comply to the state standards, right? I think that's a no-brainer, and not do any harm, because it looks like most, as far as the groundwater wells, the production wells, are all producing things, water that is, there might be some areas where they get treated for the secondaries, but the primaries are all covered, so we never want to get into an area where that is. And I think it allows us to, if you use that, those standards might become more rigorous over time. So you have to then adapt to meet the new standards. So your baseline is, improving with state standards. So I think it would be important to put, I like that language that's used in anything that we do, the primary standard, state standard.
So, but I think it's also important to build in something about that it's to do with implementing the GSP.
Right.
Because if there was a truck tanker that crashes and all this contamination gets
Sure.
into the ground, that's not something the GSA can control, right? It's only things within your control that are part of implementing the plan.
Right, that we won't impact this, to violate those standards, what we do.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we want to do anything with our plan that's going to cause water levels to drop in any part of the basin.
Right, or water quality, I think
Yeah,
we're talking
and
about
water
that.
quality, yeah. I mean, that, you don't want to do something that's going to start sucking from one place to the other.
Right, and then when we get to water levels, that is, I've chosen the groundwater quality one first because it's the easiest of the indicators, of the 4 indicators that we have to do. So, to get used to the process, we're going to be going through water quality, and there'll be much discussion when it comes to water levels, for sure.
Well, I too had kind of started with NGA's definition. I guess I didn't have the benefit of these slides. I didn't see them on the site, so I didn't have that breadth of statements. And then coupled with the prohibition against degrading quality, it seems that you've got sort of a baseline, and then actually, since our the basin's water is a little better than those state standards, you actually have a higher standard that maybe brackets as we start to think about what happens in the basin as we do work to try to recover levels, which is going to involve probably some managed recharge here and there, and what that's going to do about perhaps mobilizing plumes, we hope not, or the quality of the water that is injected or used to recharge. Presumably meeting potable water standards and where it goes in the ground. Right? Presumably that wouldn't make things worse, because I have to admit that I'm ignorant about whether there's any possible soil chemical reactions between treated potable water and the geography here. So I don't know if you could help us with that.
Yeah, when you're planning to do that, you do have to do studies to look at that geochemical interaction. Yeah, because sometimes arsenic comes out of the ground.
Right.
Yeah. So a question I want to ask you all is that, so there's different, you were talking about the different levels. What would be significant and reasonable if groundwater quality got, say for chloride, the drinking water standard is 210. Right now, say it's at 100. Would 150 be too much? Would that be significant and reasonable to the users of this basin? Or does it have to exceed that drinking water standard?
I guess I am positive we'd go with the state standard.
Okay.
And then, as Chris pointed out, that may evolve over time, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, because people can still use that water, and the drinking water standards are selected because they're the most stringent. If it's agricultural, it's a different standard. If it's recreational, it could be a different standard too. So, but drinking water is the strictest, so that's why a lot of agencies took on that. Anyone else?
I'm just wondering if the standards change over time. I know the federal government has changed standards and made them over time. Perchlorate salt over in some place like Morgan Hill, they changed the standards significantly over time. So if we set it am I correct that we would set it at the current standard perhaps, as opposed to whatever the standard is? It's up to us, I guess.
We were talking about setting it to whatever the standard evolved to, assuming it's gonna get trickier. But I guess if in a dystopian universe, it goes the other way, maybe, I don't know. Maybe-
Well, I mean, I guess one of the questions you ask is if you said it's the state standards, you can see that when we saw the levels of nitrates, arsenic, we were way below most of those places, so we could actually get worse. Yeah. And is that something that would be okay, right? Or do we want to say we want to be better by in some way?
I don't want us to get worse, but I like having a cushion, if you will, some flexibility that we could still choose to address it, but we wouldn't have to, if you will, if we didn't want to.
And I would say the state standards are pretty strict. You know, it's just that our water just doesn't happen to have it.
Right, so an example of a changing standard is chromium.
Yeah.
And I forget now it changed to be more strict. But although it's naturally occurring, it's not like it was a contaminant. So in this case, it's naturally occurring, so that's not something we would need to address.
And didn't they back off on that a little bit? Didn't they?
No, they just haven't come out with a regulation yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
There are some places that have it and, you know, don't really know how they're gonna.
Right. Yeah.
You just do the board first, and yes, we'd love to take it, but, so do we have any consensus? So when you say we're gonna write something, are we literally gonna scribe something out? Is Nick or staff, other staff gonna?
Yeah, so Perrette's taking notes, thank you Perrette, and we will, I think in the working group, we'll mull this over and come up with something, and then we'll hand it over to the wordsmithers over there.
Okay. Can we take some questions from our partners here? Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. I guess I was just wondering about when you're thinking about drinking water standards, if you would want to separate whether it's a naturally occurring or an anthropogenic source, and maybe you deal with those think of those differently. Like, yeah.
Right, none of them really, the examples that I put up there talked about the source of contamination, and it's definitely something you could think about because in this case I think it's not going to be us introducing things into the ground, it's going to be more that we're moving it around, right? And so iron and manganese is pretty much everywhere. There are places where there's TDS in the Monterey, like I showed you, and if you drew groundwater levels down, you could increase concentrations in that area. But I think the sentiment is we're going to be raising groundwater levels up, so we're not going to have that problem.
Okay, all right, that's something to consider. If that, you know, obviously no matter what it is, we don't want it to be to a bad standard, but do we want a different, you know, especially if it's one that I would think that it's anything we're introducing through what we do, that would be a good thing.
If I may, sort of building on that and going back to this notion of how the water quality and groundwater levels are going to interact, back to mobilizing or changing the direction of plumes because we've raised the groundwater level. That might be an area where, I mean, I'd be curious about, I mean, it'd be really perverse if we're prevented from improving the basin because of ground source pollution that hasn't been remediated. So, I mean, is it within our purview to say, fix it, so we can raise the water levels further to maybe historic levels? Right, if you imagine we've got this declining water level, right? We bring it back up, and now all of a sudden, you know, this stuff that's been underground above where the groundwater levels were is starting to get mobilized. Well, we're limited. We're rate limited in terms of what we can do to the basin as a result.
Yeah. So we could use the model to determine what happens to groundwater levels, and then we would have to look: is this in an area where there's how close is this going to be to septic tanks or to the existing other sources of surface contamination.
Right.
That's definitely, it's a good point, we're gonna have to consider that. But then, that's why I was explaining how these are iterative when we
Right.
develop these criteria, that you have to look at what you're gonna do with water levels and how that's gonna affect surface.
But to the question, is it within our purview to be able to mandate that whoever's responsible for that clean it up?
Well, one of the plumes in Scotts Valley is under remediation.
Okay.
Right now, the one over by Kmart. They're actually doing vaporization, whatever they call
But
it.
it takes decades, so this
Yeah, it
is
takes a
one
long
of the
time.
problems, yeah.
Well, it's gonna take decades for the
Yeah.
basic.
And it's like, it's almost, Superfund sites go on for years and years, yeah.
John?
I was gonna say that one of the agencies that's responsible, or most directly responsible for water quality is the Central Coast Regional Water Quality
Right.
Control Board that implements all the state regulations. And they have sent us a letter, sort of a generic letter, but they're very interested in the groundwater sustainability planning process, and that it takes into account water quality, and particularly water quality regarding their basin plan objectives and beneficial uses. And I think they would be a very willing partner, that if we identified a specific issue that we thought really needed more attention than they've given it so far, I think they would be responsive to that. But they are interested in being engaged and participating in the process.
Okay, that's good. Anybody else? Rosemary?
I was wondering, given the characteristics of the aquifer layers here, whether it might be interesting to consider having a different water quality criteria for the sandy soils of the Santa Margarita layer versus the deeper aquifers, because in certain ways the Santa Margarita seems, and what's maybe more vulnerable to anthropogenic sources in particular. I don't know if it's a good idea or not, but it just sort of strikes me that some of the data that you showed kind of described some of the issues in the context of what's going on in the more sandy soil basins versus what's going on in other parts of the aquifer.
Yeah, it'd be pretty hard technically to justify, I'm not sure, but that's, Perret's written it down, I'll have to consider it more, yeah. Yeah, we did think about it, but in the end, it ended up all being lumped together, but I don't know, I would like to explore it further.
Heidi, did you have something? Okay, you just. Yes. Lily.
In trying to craft a statement of significant and unreasonable, it seems to me it's a bit, what we're doing is a bit like trying to reinvent the wheel, and starting out at ground zero and trying to develop something. In the minutes of the last meeting, there was an ACWA Groundwater Committee meeting minutes of February 11th, where they talked about the fact that there are now 24 GSPs posted on the state website. Of the 46 that were submitted, what if we just, whoever went to this meeting and summarized these notes, if they also had the ability to look at what those GSPs were and how they might help us in doing this, it would seem to me like all we then have to deal with is the difference between what they're facing and the uniqueness of us, as opposed to starting at ground zero.
Well,
if that makes any sense.
Yeah, the 6 examples I took came from that source. I went to look at all those GSPs to get that. So, and they're all pretty much the same flavor.
So you already did summarize?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, we want to put them up again so we can be looking at them.
Yeah.
See if that's for something.
There were these 6, 3 on this page and 3 on the other, but you know what? They're a lot of them are fairly vague, and they're talking about that it mustn't, that the quality cannot affect their beneficial uses, and that often they link it to the quantity of water being taken. So sometimes when you have degraded water quality, say you move the plume, you can now no longer use that as a resource. You've limited your resource, so that's why they tie it to
supply.
To supply, yeah. let me see the next page. They had the baseline.
Yeah, I like the Salinas one in the sense that they refer to the state standards.
Right.
You know.
So this is where it gets in. So once we take, so for example, for Mid-County, we had this statement of significant and unreasonable. And then we translated to what does it mean for undesirable results. So the minimum threshold became the drinking water standard. And we said that pretty much the same, but it's same as what it has there, and it's any well that falls. And so we didn't say, oh, it could only, 80% of the wells have to be better quality, or we said any well that fails to meet drinking water standards, it's undesirable. As soon as one well, that's pretty strict, right? And so we took this statement and then developed the undesirable results and minimum thresholds from it. So what you're talking about is more a minimum, is more a
Right.
undesirable result statement.
Right.
Yeah.
Or minimum threshold.
Yeah, we could combine.
Right.
Okay, so we can go back and we can draft something. We will be bringing it back because now the next meeting we're going to be talking about the undesirable results and a method for coming up with measurable minimum thresholds. And I say this one's easy because you can see the writing on the wall here. We're going to probably choose state drinking water standards that most other people they have selected throughout the state, and then measurable objectives is something else. And that's the one where we'll probably do a little bit of analysis to come up with. But you're one step up the ladder there, up the building blocks on this indicator. Okay? I see thumbs up. Good.
Okay. Thank you, Georgiana. Okay. Well, that's a lot. We look forward to that for the next meeting. Staff reports. Legal counsel, Terry Rainey.
Good evening, everybody. I'm going to get on my tippy toes here. I'm going to talk about alternates tonight for just a few minutes. Last meeting there was a question raised about whether alternates should be allowed greater participation in JPA meetings. And it's a really simple question, and it's amazingly complicated when you come up with the answer, or at least try to come up with the answer. JPA agreement says in section 6.4 that alternates shall have no vote and cannot participate in discussions or deliberations of the board. We have an 11-member board. We have 7 alternates. And there's arguments back and forth on increasing alternate participation. The arguments in favor of it say, hey, these alternates need some incentive to want to come here and they're giving their time, they're sitting here, their input is valuable. On the other hand, the argument goes, well, this was a very carefully weighed board, and we don't want certain segments to have more weight than others because the 11-member board is very carefully structured. But the third issue that cropped up was a Brown Act violation, not of this board, but a Brown Act violation of the 3-member agencies. The 3-member agencies are San Lorenzo Valley Water District, Scotts Valley Water District, and the county. Now the county does not have any issues because their alternate is a staff member, so we can kind of just say, don't worry about the county. So now we're down to worried about 2 agencies. And those 2 agencies are the 2 water districts. The Brown Act says if you have a majority of members in a room deliberating on a certain matter or discussing a certain matter, that could be a violation of the Brown Act. But there is something called a public agency exception. So if you are in a publicly noticed meeting, then there can be a majority of board members involved. So there's a specific statute that I mentioned in my little report. But the Brown Act issue is not an issue for us to decide. The Brown Act issue is an issue for the attorney for the San Lorenzo Valley Water District and the attorney for the Scotts Valley Water District to decide, because we're not in violation of the Brown Act. It's those agencies that have to be concerned and give us direction. So that is why my little report says, I think we're going to look and evaluate, contact San Lorenzo Valley Water District and Scotts Valley Water District General Counsel. I think we're going to go to the county council as well, just to get their feedback. You know, this could all be avoided if all alternates were staff members or members of the public. You know, we could just skirt the whole issue if we wanted to. But let's assume we don't want to fire our current alternates, because we thank you for your service. I think I'm just going to continue on the path of working with council, trying to get some solid answers, and ultimately they're the ones who are going to have to make the decision on this. Anybody have any questions?
Not really questions, other than just, I understand what you've written up here and what you're saying, but I think if you go by the case law or the studies and the decisions that exist out in the world, right, they probably entirely ignore groundwater management agencies of the unique flavor that now exists for the first time ever. And this is a unique JPA, as there are multiples throughout the state, where it's not just member agencies that are on the board, you know, of which the sitting board members and the alternates are elected officials for the most part. Those of us that are representing private well owners, we're not elected, right? So it's a different type of alternate. And by asking the question, continually bringing this up, because this is, you know, the umpteenth time we've talked about it in some flavor or another, it's not to get special treatment for private well owners, it's to get because when they're alternates and they're sitting in the audience, yeah, they should not be able to participate in the board part of the discussion or in voting. But as soon as it's turned over to comment from the general public, they're not elected officials. They should be able to comment. And what they have to say is valuable. And if we don't find a way to include them, then it's like the best way to nullify or silence an educated member of the general public is to just make them an alternate private well owner. I mean, and I don't think we want to do that. Anyway.
Well, I don't know what we want to do, and so what you're suggesting, and I'm not taking a position on any of this, is you're suggesting that the private well owners be treated differently than the public well owner alternates, and that would be harder to manage. You know, this is a pretty hard board to manage to begin with, but different rules for different segments might be interesting.
But we already have those different rules because our votes don't count the same as the seated officials on the board. We're not part of a unanimous requirement for passing this thing.
Correct. The member agencies.
We're contributors, but in a way we just sort of, you know, I don't know, we put a sticker on this whole thing that there's participation from the public, but
and so do other people from the city of Scotts Valley. They're not voting members like that. And
yeah.
Dale from Mount Hermon Association.
We've essentially got 3 different flavors, and it's,
right.
you know.
But for my purpose is just to make sure that our members are comfortable with whatever rules on alternate participation. And then from there we can ask those questions. If we want different levels of participation among different elements in this board, that could be part of the things that are discussed. But we have to get over I think the big hurdle right now is the Brown Act.
Well, I'm personally, you know, fine with what Eden is suggesting, just from my 2 cents. But I think it's not my call.
Well, this is something that is in the JPA.
Yeah,
so
I get it.
whatever we do, we need to amend either JPA or we can amend bylaws, writing their further clarification on JPA. But at the moment, we don't have full set of information
right.
to bring to you something. So I think we want to do due diligence to make sure we have all of the information, and then the board can decide, considering that, which way they would like to.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting doing anything. I'm just
yeah.
stating it for the record.
I don't I don't know if it's, I understand what you're saying, Brett, but I think some of it's the interpretation of the way the JPA is written. I think it's written accurately, but it doesn't go the extra mile of segmenting or dividing when an alternate is trying to participate, like I might have, 2 years ago in the board discussion, which was inappropriate, or when the alternate's just acting as a member of the public.
Yeah, I hear you, and we're taking all that and we would like to bring it back once to the board without having, well, what about this, can we do that? So we're just gathering more information, and hopefully by next time we have this piece of the puzzle too, and then you can make the decision that you think is best for this agency, knowing all of the details.
Okay, yes, Jack.
Yeah, I've heard it said that, and here we're just talking about San Lorenzo Valley Water District and Scotch Valley Water District. I've heard it said that if the majority happen to be here as city members and alternate, that the only areas that might violate the Brown Act would be if the subject matter was likely to go for action to those particular boards. In other words, is it something that's everything's relevant, I know, but if it was not likely to lead to an actual action by one of those two boards, that it might not be a violation of the Brown Act. What do you think of that?
That's not my understanding. My understanding is if it's to hear, discuss, or participate in anything under the jurisdiction of the agency, it's a broader, but I do think that we do have a express exception, another public agency exception, that I think that the San Lorenzo Valley Water District Council wants to confirm that they are comfortable relying on the exception. So as long as we have an open and noticed meeting, then it's okay for San Lorenzo Valley to have a majority here. There's an express exception under the Brown Act. And that's what Gina Nichols from the San Lorenzo Valley Water District is looking into.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, anyone comment on Terry?
I think I agree with Mr. Cassidy, that as long as alternates are not voting as board members and not participating in that board discussion like we just had, I kind of agree with him. And yeah, there's several subdivisions that talk about attendance of a majority of the board at a different kind of a meeting than a board meeting. So somehow I think it would be okay for the alternates to participate, is my opinion. I count 10, but you said there are 11 board members. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Bruce. Yes?
One of the questions I think in this would be whether, if you opened it up to the alternates on the special district, for example, participating in the subject matter of this meeting, would you also be opening it up to the other directors at the same time? And
yes.
Would you be able to, and that would be probably not what you're intending to do, is to have ones who are not, directors who are not either on this agency or alternates being a participant in.
Well, I think what we were talking about is having, them participate as members of the public, not during board deliberation. So if during public comment they wanted to make a comment, especially during an informational session, that they would be okay. That's what we're talking about, the possibility of. Yeah, it's going to be up to each, like Terry said, if one of the member agencies council says you can't do that, or we'll get in trouble, because I'm worried about our board getting sued or something, then I think we'll be in a difficult position.
Well, then you have a decision still to be made. Do you want to create different categories?
Right, and we can do that.
But if that is not true, then you have another option of making all alternates to be able to say something during public comment.
Yeah.
So that's the piece that is missing.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. Pierrette, is there something administratively?
I do have a few items I wanted to inform you. First is we have hired an intern Scottsdale Water District has hired an intern to develop the youth outreach program for Santa Margarita Groundwater Agency as directed by this board, and she's actually here, so I wanted to introduce her. It's Kelly Krotkoff here, and it's a brand new thing. We had just under contract 2 days ago, and she will be getting to know all of us on the working group, and then trying to come up with something that hopefully will get more younger people interested in this subject. Those ones that will be impacted by our decisions 20, 50 years down the road. So welcome, Kelly. And then just as many of you might have seen it, that the MGA's Mid-County Groundwater Agency's GSP is posted now on Sigma portal, statewide Sigma portal, and so that happened on February 19th, and it started a 75-day period, public comment period for them. So the state is kind of going through that review period, and a big part of that is this. And I do have one change order coming, so I wanted to let you know about that. It's Montgomery & Associates. I believe in September board packet, we had a letter from them that was kind of putting you on notice that most likely the modeling piece is going to take more money than originally anticipated, and the board was okay with that. So we do have a change order that we're preparing for your approval for next board meeting, and there's quite a bit more that has happened and they still need to do. So it's going to be 108,000 and change more. So I just wanted you to be aware of that. It's coming. We do not have, Georgina had to leave, and she would not be the appropriate person from Montgomery to know the details of that modeling. But if you have any questions, forward them to staff so we can make sure we have the responses by next time. One positive thing about that is we actually did need some additional expenses in order to qualify for the second grant, because we could not have received the 600,000 unless we spent 200,000 more than was in our original budget. So it's helping us.
Wow.
That's good.
Okay, and individual director reports. Anybody, have anything to report, or have any travel or training they want to tell us about? Hearing none. So the future items, I think everyone's seen that. Informational item. And that's calendar. And then brings us to number 10.
So moved.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you everybody for coming. You guys are a tough lot.
So this new information